this house is sentimental and it doesn't matter what it is.
I understand.
Do you? You keep talking business like.
No.
While the entire world was paralyzed by the sudden silence of empty streets and shuttered businesses, while families across America sat at kitchen tables trying to stretch dwindling paychecks and wondering how they would survive another week, Cody Brown and his favored wife Robyn carefully curated a different kind of story, a narrative that played not only on the screens of a television audience desperate for distraction, but also in the corridors of government. Bureaucracy, where signatures and numbers could transform desperation into opportunity. And though to the public eye they wept, fretted, and spoke endlessly of crumbling finances and fractured family unity, behind those carefully choreographed scenes, according to federal investigators and newly unearthed records, a more audacious reality was unfolding. One where the pandemic was not a crushing weight, but a stage upon which the Browns allegedly performed their boldest deception yet. A scheme that would blur the line between reality television drama and cold, calculated financial fraud. For when viewers saw Cody pacing with heavy steps through the Flagstaff mansion, complaining of mortgages too vast to manage, and when Robyn clutched tissues lamenting how the family was drowning in costs from Coyote Pass, what they did not see was the simultaneous paper trail being etched into government systems, applications that spoke of thriving businesses and bustling payrolls that did not exist, claims of employees who were not employees, signatures inked beneath solemn oaths of truth that prosecutors now describe as the very foundation of a federal crime. And this dual performance, tears for the cameras, numbers for the SBA, would set the stage for what the government later characterized as a conspiracy to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars away from relief funds meant for truly desperate families. Because as ordinary Americans scrambled to pay rent or keep small diners alive, the Browns allegedly saw a jackpot hidden within the chaos. A lifeline not for workers but for their own lavish stability. A chance to maintain million-dollar homes, new luxury trucks, and the veneer of success even as their reality show narrative leaned heavily on victimhood. And it is within this collision of illusion and indictment that the true drama begins. A labyrinth where the Browns' long history of failed ventures, from the short-lived gym in Utah to the hollow shell of my sister-wife's closet, became not cautionary tales but convenient props resurrected on paper to justify vast sums of taxpayer money. Because though the online boutique had long fallen silent with outdated products and abandoned social media pages, it reappeared in loan documents as a 10-employee business gasping for survival. And though Cody Brown Family Entertainment LLC was little more than the contractual vessel through which TLC funds arrived, on official forms it too was portrayed as a bustling employer in need of immediate rescue. And with each sworn certification, with each inflated number, the gap between what viewers were told and what the government would later allege widened into a chasm so stark that even loyal fans who once sympathized with the Browns' televised struggles would feel betrayed. For the Browns were not merely mismanaging funds or exaggerating hardship. Prosecutors say they were exploiting a nation's crisis, manipulating systems designed to preserve livelihoods, and in doing so, committing acts that would unravel not only their public image but the very foundation of trust that had kept their sprawling, polygamous experiment afloat for years. And as the prosecutors began to peel back the glossy surface of televised confessions and public sympathy, what emerged was a portrait not of a family crumbling under the weight of circumstance, but of a patriarch and his chosen partner who allegedly viewed the chaos as cover, who saw the endless backlog of desperate PPP and idle applications flooding the Small Business Administration as a fog in which their own fraudulent claims could hide, unnoticed, approved, and deposited before anyone thought to question whether an online jewelry shop that had ceased functioning years earlier could suddenly need to preserve 10 paychecks. And this detail, that number 10, became the thread investigators would later tug upon, unraveling the narrative stitch by stitch. Because 10 was not simply a convenient round figure, it was the fabricated population of a ghost payroll populated, the government argued, by family members who had never filed W-2s, who had never received regular deposits, who had not in any formal sense been employees in years, if ever, and yet there they were on documents signed under penalty of perjury, conjured into existence as the invisible workforce whose salvation supposedly required 6 figures of taxpayer money. And with that one certification, the Browns had transformed familial ties into fiscal tools, converting sons and daughters into placeholders on a spreadsheet. And as investigators followed the money trail, they discovered that within days of deposits hitting business accounts, large transfers leapt across to personal mortgages, luxury purchases, and the steady reinforcement of Cody and Robyn's insulated life. starkly contrasted against the struggles of the other wives. For while Janelle was reduced to living in an RV on raw Coyote Pass land, and Christine fretted over selling her home to regain independence, Cody and Robyn allegedly insulated themselves with relief funds meant to keep small-town cafes alive, to stop mechanics from shuttering their garages, to prevent waitresses and barbers from joining unemployment queues. And in this divergence lies the moral outrage at the heart of the prosecution's case. For it was not merely that laws had been broken, but that the very spirit of communal sacrifice had been mocked. That a family who once marketed itself as a model of unity and shared struggle had in fact chosen division, privilege, and deceit, using the pain of millions as the backdrop for their own survival. And so when federal subpoenas began arriving, when years of bank records, corporate filings, and tax returns were demanded, the myth of poverty collapsed under the weight of cold numbers. Deposits from TLC juxtaposed against pleas of hardship. Mortgage payments traced directly to federal loans. Vehicles and renovations purchased, while cameras rolled on carefully rehearsed scenes of despair. And for investigators, the picture became clear. The Browns were not overwhelmed parents making clumsy errors in paperwork. They were deliberate actors in a scheme that treated a national emergency as a personal windfall, a family business as a convenient mask, and loyalty as a resource to be exploited, even if it meant using their own children's names as collateral in deception. And this revelation would transform the narrative forever, shifting it from quirky reality TV dysfunction into the solemn register of felony fraud. A story no longer measured in ratings but in counts of conspiracy, wire fraud, and betrayal writ large against a backdrop of pandemic fear and national suffering. Because the deeper investigators dug, the more they found that this alleged fraud was not an isolated misstep, but part of a broader pattern, a way of life that blurred lines between family, fame, and finance. For Cody had long cultivated the image of a burdened patriarch staggering under the weight of 4 households, endless children, and sprawling properties. Yet when the lens shifted from television editing rooms to financial forensics, what appeared instead was a man who channeled resources selectively, pouring comfort into the household he shared with Robyn while others scraped by. And the PPP loans became the ultimate expression of that imbalance. A stream of taxpayer dollars that kept the Flagstaff mansion secure while Janelle pitched tents and Christine sold furniture. And what makes this tale so piercing is not only the betrayal of law, but the betrayal of kin. For when Pedon and Mykelti later stood in court and testified that their names had been used without consent, the illusion of a family business crumbled into a tableau of exploitation. A father willing to treat his children not as heirs, but as shields, drafting them into a phantom workforce they knew nothing about. And this revelation turned the trial into more than a case about forged documents. It became a parable of broken trust, exposing the fragile architecture of Cody's authority. Because if his children could declare under oath that he had lied, if his wives could point to years of gaslighting and financial marginalization, then the jury no longer saw him as a misunderstood patriarch, but as the architect of a conspiracy that played out on both screens and ledgers. And meanwhile, Robyn, who once appeared as the tearful peacemaker, was recast as an accomplice. Her signature standing alongside his on applications that promised jobs would be saved while bank statements told another story. And as prosecutors projected those statements onto screens for the jury, showing transfers timed with uncanny precision to loan deposits, the performance collapsed. The tears seemed hollow. And the question that hung in the air was not whether they had exaggerated hardship for television, but whether they had orchestrated hardship as a mask to cover greed. And though the Browns' defense spoke of confusion, of complex structures and misunderstood rules, the sheer clarity of evidence, round numbers, ghost payrolls, defunct businesses resurrected only on paper, cut through, leaving behind a narrative not of naivety but of calculation. And as this first chapter of the case unfolded, the courtroom itself became the stage on which the Browns' dual identities collided, the sorrowful victims they portrayed to millions. And the alleged fraudsters revealed through bank transfers, signatures, and sworn testimony, a collision so dramatic it threatened to overshadow even the most sensational scenes ever filmed for their reality show. Because here, under oath, there was no editing, no confessional booth, no soundtrack to manipulate emotion. Only the stark confrontation between words spoken in front of cameras and numbers etched in ink on federal forms. A confrontation that would carry the trial into its most explosive revelations and set the course for everything that followed, as the courtroom adjusted to the weight of those revelations and the jury silently absorbed the spectacle of a father and stepmother. Entangled in their own signatures, the case surged forward into its most damning phase. For it was no longer enough to demonstrate discrepancies on paper. The prosecution sought to drag the ghosts of the payroll into flesh and blood by summoning Cody and Robyn's own children, young adults who carried not only their family name, but the emotional burden of testifying against their patriarch. And when Mykelti took the stand, her voice trembled with the weight of divided loyalty, confessing that while she once modeled jewelry for her mother's boutique as a teenager, she had never been an employee in 2020, never received a paycheck, never filed tax forms, and her quiet admission cut through the defense's narrative like glass. For in that single moment, the jury witnessed the collapse of the family business facade, and when Paydon followed, his words were even sharper, laced with barely concealed anger as he declared that he had been listed as staff for a company he had not touched in nearly a decade, scoffing at the suggestion that he had ever been on payroll. And the effect was devastating because the so-called employees were not anonymous names who could not be tracked. They were the very children the jury could see sitting before them, flesh and blood repudiations of Cody's sworn declarations. And so the trial transformed into something more visceral, less about forms and more about betrayal, with each testimony reframing the Browns not as confused entrepreneurs, but as manipulators of their own kin. And then came Robyn, stepping into the witness box with her soft-spoken manner and trembling tissue, attempting to resurrect her carefully crafted persona as the misunderstood wife overwhelmed by circumstances. Yet her performance unraveled with alarming speed under the steady cross-examination of prosecutor Morales, who pinned her down with cold questions about signatures, pay stubs that never existed, and the blunt reality of an $80,000 transfer to her mortgage lender just days after federal funds landed in her account. And as the bank statements glowed on the screen, the sobs that once inspired sympathy now drew contempt. For the jurors saw not a victim, but a willing participant who attested under oath that lies were truth. And Cody's turn at the stand only deepened the chasm, his arrogance clashing with Morales' precision as he alternated between fiery defiance and flustered evasions, one moment declaring he had a huge family to feed, and the next being confronted with footage of himself lamenting poverty on national television, while bank records displayed six-figure deposits from TLC, and each contradiction stripped away another layer of credibility until what remained was not a patriarch, but a performer whose script had finally run out of stage directions. And as the days of testimony stretched on, the jury was no longer watching a family drama, but a slow unraveling of trust, seeing how the communal sacrifice Cody once preached had always masked a funnel of resources toward himself and Robyn, how the pandemic loans were not an aberration, but the culmination of years of imbalance. And the weight of that betrayal settled not only over the courtroom, but over the wives who watched from afar, women who had once been told that every sacrifice was for the good of the family, only to discover in public that their sacrifices had been the currency of a private empire built on deception. And in this way, part 2 of the saga unfolded, not with gentle revelations, but with the sharp cadence of cross-examinations, where tears were measured against transactions, loyalty against law, and the very foundations of the Brown household collapsed beneath the unforgiving scrutiny of federal justice. And with every hour that passed inside that courtroom, the case grew less about confusing paperwork and more about character. Because while defense counsel tried to frame Cody and Robyn as overwhelmed parents fumbling with complex applications during a chaotic national emergency, the prosecution sharpened its focus on intent, building the image of two people who had rehearsed sympathy for cameras and precision for loan officers. And the impact of this dual narrative was immense. For jurors were ordinary citizens who had lived through the same pandemic, some of whom had likely known businesses that shuttered or neighbors who lost jobs. And so when they saw federal documents with ghost payrolls juxtaposed against luxury purchases, when they listened to children testify that their names were used without permission, the betrayal felt personal, almost visceral. And Morales used that empathy with surgical skill, weaving together the Browns' televised victimhood with their financial reality, showing that the same mouths which cried scarcity on TLC were fed by taxpayer money intended for struggling restaurants, barbers, and daycare centers. And in that exposure, the Browns' image shifted from eccentric reality stars to symbols of opportunistic greed. But what made the unraveling so profound was not only the evidence of fraud, but the emotional collapse of the family unit itself. For sister wives had always marketed chaos contained by loyalty, tension soothed by faith, yet here, under the oath-bound spotlight of federal justice, those same ties were weaponized, children forced to contradict their father, wives realizing their decades of sacrifice had been mortgaged for lies, and the story deepened into tragedy, one where the betrayal of government trust was mirrored by the betrayal of domestic trust. Because if Cody could use his own children as names on a fabricated payroll, then what claim did he have left to leadership, to fatherhood, to honesty? And it was this hollowness that prosecutors hammered again and again. Playing clips of the show where Cody lamented broken finances and contrasting them with hard numbers on oversized boards, exposing each inconsistency as though stripping paint from a wall until the structure beneath was revealed in all its cracks. And when the defense attempted to pivot, suggesting that cultural complexity of a polygamous household created misunderstandings, Morales dismantled it by pointing out that confusion did not generate fabricated employees or wire transfers to personal mortgage lenders. Confusion did not create a ghost payroll of 10. Confusion did not explain signatures under penalty of perjury. And in this steady rhythm, the government's case gained momentum like a tide, washing away sympathy, drowning defenses, until even those who once believed Cody's bluster began to wonder if his entire persona was a con. And as spectators whispered in the gallery and headlines filtered out into the public, the narrative transformed from one about messy reality TV stars to a cautionary tale about how easily fame could be leveraged into fraud, and how the pandemic, which brought genuine suffering to millions, had been seen by some not as a crisis to endure but as a lottery to rig. And in that transformation, Part 2 revealed its true theme: that beneath the drama of court testimony lay a much larger story about trust betrayed, institutions exploited, and a family once filmed for entertainment, now serving as a parable of arrogance undone by evidence too stark to ignore. And as each witness stepped down and each document was entered into evidence, the cumulative weight of the case pressed heavier upon the Browns. For while Cody tried to keep his swagger, glancing defiantly at jurors as though charm might still carry him through, the gap between his bravado and the cold precision of financial records widened with every exhibit, and Robyn's tears, once her strongest defense, now seemed rehearsed, her trembling voice undercut by the undeniable mathematics of bank transfers. And in that dissonance, the story revealed something even deeper than fraud. It revealed the anatomy of manipulation, the way public personas could be carefully engineered to inspire pity, while private actions siphoned resources into comforts denied to others. And it was here that Morales struck hardest, turning the very themes of sister wives against them. For she reminded the jury of the communal sacrifices the show portrayed, of Janelle selling jewelry and Christine pinching pennies, of Mary running a bed and breakfast to keep money flowing, and then she juxtaposed those sacrifices against Cody and Robyn's million-dollar mansion payments, allegedly propped up by relief funds. And the contrast was so stark that jurors could almost feel the sting of betrayal, not just as taxpayers, but as human beings who recognized the injustice of one wife living in an RV, while another enjoyed a mortgage cushioned by fraudulent loans. And beyond the personal drama lay the larger national wound, because the PPP and idle funds were more than numbers. They were symbols of hope in a desperate time, a collective act of trust by a country in crisis. And when Cody and Robyn allegedly chose to manipulate that system, they were not simply breaking rules. They were tearing at the fragile fabric of solidarity that had kept small towns alive through lockdowns. And in exposing this betrayal, the prosecution tapped into something raw, a sense that greed had masqueraded as struggle, that fame had cloaked fraud, and that a family once marketed as unusual but relatable had in fact crossed into something unforgivable. And as the second act of the trial reached its crescendo, the Browns stood increasingly isolated, their defense crumbling under the relentless pressure of testimony, evidence, and moral outrage. And what remained was the anticipation of a verdict that would not only decide their future but also deliver a message about accountability. In an age where appearances could no longer protect against the truth etched into bank ledgers and sworn under oath, and when the weight of testimony, documents, and contradictions could no longer be ignored, the jury was dismissed to deliberate, carrying with them not just folders of evidence, but the haunting image of children forced to testify against their father, of wives watching from the margins as years of hidden inequities spilled into the open. And though the defense prayed for mercy, for some flicker of doubt to fracture the prosecution's wall, the jurors returned in less than 4 hours, their speed a verdict in itself. And as they filed back into the courtroom, the silence was suffocating. Cody shifting restlessly, jaw clenched, trying to project confidence he no longer possessed. Robyn already trembling with tears that seemed less like sorrow and more like dread. And then the foreman rose, his voice steady as he pronounced guilty on count after count. Conspiracy to defraud the United States. Wire fraud, false statements, each word striking like a hammer. And with every repetition, Cody's mask slipped further until his face hung slack in disbelief, while Robyn broke into sobs so piercing they echoed off the marble walls. But the gavel fell and there was no edit, no TLC soundtrack to soften the blow. only the blunt reality that their carefully constructed empire of sympathy and manipulation had collapsed beneath the weight of federal law, and weeks later at sentencing, Judge Harmon's words carved through whatever dignity they had left. For he reminded them and the nation that these loans had been lifelines meant to keep small businesses breathing, that they were drawn from the shared sacrifices of taxpayers during the darkest hours of the pandemic, and that to treat them as jackpots was not only theft, but betrayal of neighbor and country alike. And his fury was matched by the punishment: 5 years each in federal prison, restitution of every stolen dollar, and punitive fines that ensured their Flagstaff mansion would never again feel like a fortress of privilege. And as marshals led them away in handcuffs, the symbolism was stark: the king and queen of the Brown household dethroned, their crowns traded for prison numbers, their empire of manipulation reduced to rubble. And for Christine and Janelle, the verdict was more than justice. It was vindication, proof that their years of sacrifice had not been delusions, that their pleas for fairness had not been rebellion but warnings. And as the cameras outside captured their calm relief, the story transformed one last time, from a tale of fraud into a story of survival, of women who had walked away from dysfunction before it consumed them entirely. And in that moment, the world saw the Browns not as sister wives, but as a fractured dynasty undone by greed, arrogance, and betrayal. A cautionary epic of how the illusion of unity can collapse when truth finally claws its way to the surface. And yet the real aftermath of that verdict was not contained within the courtroom walls or the sentencing documents, but in the shifting identities of everyone who had been orbiting Cody's gravity for decades. Because while headlines screamed of guilty counts and prison terms, within the family itself, a quieter revolution was taking place. As Christine walked into her new chapter, not as the wife who abandoned the dream, but as the woman who had preserved her sanity and dignity before the entire empire collapsed, her courage reframed not as betrayal, but foresight. And Janelle, too, found vindication in knowing that her years of frugality, her willingness to endure discomfort in an RV rather than be swallowed by debt, had spared her from being implicated in the fraudulent schemes. And Mary, long clinging to the belief that loyalty would someday earn her place back in Cody's heart, was forced to reckon with the brutal truth that the man she had once trusted had not only discarded her emotionally, but had gambled away the moral foundation of the family itself. And so the wives who once existed as supporting characters in Cody's narrative of patriarchal control now emerged as survivors of a deception bigger than marital neglect. Survivors of a system where their sacrifices had subsidized a fraud. And as for the children, their testimony had not only helped convict their father, but had fractured the myth of unity forever. Because no reality television storyline could mask the image of McKelty's tearful whispers or Pedon's fiery denials. And the fan community too shifted. Once divided between sympathy and criticism, now overwhelmingly united in outrage, seeing the Browns not as quirky victims of circumstance but as symbols of exploitation, and the cultural conversation grew louder, with commentators drawing parallels between the Browns and countless other public figures who used fame as a shield, debating how easily pandemic relief funds had been misused, and whether accountability would reach beyond this one family. And in that wider discourse, Cody's name became shorthand for arrogance undone, for greed masquerading as hardship. And in prison intake photos, the man who once strutted across Flagstaff land proclaiming vision and destiny looked small, diminished, stripped of charisma, while Robyn's red-rimmed eyes betrayed the collapse of her carefully crafted persona. No longer the misunderstood peacemaker, but the co-conspirator of a crime that history would not forget. And as weeks turned into months, their absence left a vacuum in the very show that had once funded their lifestyle. A program now shadowed by the knowledge that its central figures were no longer eccentric spouses but convicted felons. And that transformation, more than any courtroom verdict, marked the end of an era, the final unraveling of a family whose public image had always been a carefully edited illusion, now replaced by the unvarnished reality that greed, once disguised as survival, had destroyed not only their freedom but the fragile trust of every person who had ever believed their story. And yet, even as the prison doors closed behind Cody and Robyn, the echoes of their downfall rippled outward like aftershocks, reshaping not only the lives of their children and former wives, but also the cultural legacy of their story. For Sister Wives had once promised audiences a glimpse into the complexities of love, faith, and unconventional family life. Yet in its final chapters, what it delivered was a cautionary tale of unchecked pride, the corrosive hunger for status, and the moral bankruptcy that emerges when empathy is performed for cameras but never practiced in reality. And Christine, standing free with her children, no longer carried the label of rebel wife but wore the mantle of survivor. Her laughter in new interviews ringing not as defiance but as triumph over years of manipulation. While Janelle too found strength in reclaiming her independence. Her decision to endure hardship outside the mansion reframed as wisdom rather than weakness. And Mary, though scarred, discovered that the closure she had sought from Cody would never come from his approval, but from the undeniable fact that truth had stripped him of the authority she once feared. And in this new order, the women who had once been framed as dependent now emerged as the enduring pillars of resilience. While Cody and Robyn, confined within concrete walls and fluorescent lights, faced the bitter irony that the very audience they had courted with carefully orchestrated tears now watched their downfall with grim satisfaction. For the story had outgrown their control. The edits no longer theirs to dictate. The soundtrack replaced by the clanging of cell doors. And the fans who once debated their choices now discussed their crimes. Their names invoked not in gossip, but in caution, a reminder of how fame without integrity curdles into infamy. And so the curtain fell, not with the soft fade out of a TLC finale, but with the gavel of federal justice, declaring in no uncertain terms that no family, no matter how complex, no star, no matter how familiar, is above the law. And as Christine and Janelle walked forward into futures untethered, as the children rebuilt trust away from the shadow of betrayal, the saga of the Browns became less about polygamy and more about humanity. Less about reality television and more about accountability. And in that final reckoning, the man who once boasted of leading a kingdom was revealed to be nothing more than a prisoner of his own lies. And the woman who wept beside him was unmasked as his accomplice. And the wives who were once cast as the ones who left were finally recognized as the ones who escaped, carrying with them not shame but survival, not bitterness but freedom. And as the world turned the page, the lesson remained etched in collective memory. That when deceit masquerades as struggle, when arrogance consumes empathy, when trust is traded for greed, the end is inevitable. And the empire, no matter how carefully staged, will always collapse under the weight of truth.